December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest. A wall of fog hides 3 German armies. High command is convinced the enemy is beaten. They are wrong. While Allied officers prepare for Christmas parties in Paris, the thin American line is about to shatter under the weight of a massive, desperate Nazi counteroffensive. The assumptions behind Allied confidence had been built over months of steady advance. German forces in the West appeared exhausted, short of fuel, short of men, and increasingly unable to coordinate large operations. Intelligence summaries emphasized collapse, retreat, and disorganization. The Ardennes sector, rugged and forested, was judged unsuitable for major armored movement in winter, and therefore ideal for resting green American divisions and refitting battered ones. That judgment shaped every decision that followed, thinning the line precisely where the enemy intended to strike. The German plan depended entirely on surprise. Hitler's order concentrated the remaining operational armor of the Western Front into a single gamble aimed at Antwerp, the logistical heart of the Allied advance. If the port fell, Allied supply lines would collapse, severing British and American armies from the fuel and ammunition needed to sustain operations. The offensive was not designed for long-term success, but for strategic shock, a blow intended to fracture Allied unity, force negotiations, and alter the political balance before Germany's inevitable defeat. In the early hours before dawn, German artillery opened fire across a front stretching nearly 80 miles. Infantry followed, moving through fog so thick that forward observers were blind. American outposts vanished in minutes. Communications failed almost immediately. Entire regiments were cut off before headquarters understood they were under attack. Reports reaching Allied command posts were fragmented, contradictory, and often dismissed as exaggerations. The assumption that Germany could not mount such an operation delayed recognition of the scale of the crisis. By midday, armored spearheads were breaking through weakly held sectors, exploiting roads that Allied planners believed unusable in winter. German units advanced with orders to bypass resistance, leaving isolated pockets behind to be eliminated later. Fuel shortages plagued the attackers, but captured American depots temporarily solved the problem, allowing the offensive to continue beyond its initial timetable. The American line did not bend, it fractured. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. If the line snapped, the Allies lose their primary supply port at Antwerp. The Western Front splits in two. Trapped divisions will be annihilated, and a war that was supposed to end by Christmas will bleed well into 1946. These were not abstract possibilities, but operational realities unfolding hour by hour as German columns pushed deeper into Belgium. At Supreme Headquarters, the reaction was disbelief followed by urgency. Eisenhower's staff scrambled to determine the scope of the attack, rerouting divisions already committed to offensive operations elsewhere. The crisis demanded speed, yet every available option seemed constrained by distance, weather, and logistical limits. Reinforcements from the north and south faced icy roads, congested supply lines, and the ever-present risk of German air attack should the weather clear. But while confusion dominated most command centers, one headquarters was already executing a plan. George S. Patton did not wait for full confirmation of the breakthrough. Weeks earlier, during routine staff meetings, he had insisted that the German army retain the capability and the incentive for a counterstroke in the Ardennes. His reasoning was simple and unsentimental. A defeated enemy fights hardest when cornered, and Hitler's strategic choices had long ignored conventional logic. Patton had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for a rapid change of axis, including a complete reorientation of Third Army operations. The maneuver required moving multiple corps northward in winter conditions, coordinating fuel, ammunition, traffic control, and command transitions without halting momentum. Most senior officers considered such a pivot unrealistic, if not reckless. Patton treated it as inevitable. When news of the German offensive arrived, Patton did not ask whether Third Army could turn north. He asked how fast. His operations officers pulled plans from drawers already marked, revised timetables measured in hours rather than days, and issued orders while other commands were still debating intentions. Units already in motion were redirected mid-march. Supply convoys were rerouted without waiting for formal approval. Discipline, rehearsed flexibility, and relentless pressure replaced hesitation. The logistical challenge was immense. Roads were narrow, icy, and clogged with refugees and retreating units. Vehicles broke down in freezing temperatures. Drivers operated under blackout conditions to avoid German aircraft. Traffic control points worked continuously, redirecting columns with minimal delay. Artillery units leapfrogged forward, ensuring that fire support would arrive with the infantry and armor rather than days behind them. Patton personally briefed Eisenhower, stating that he could attack north with 3 divisions within 48 hours. The claim stunned the room. No other commander could offer a comparable response. Eisenhower authorized the move immediately, understanding that the speed of Patton's reaction might determine whether the German offensive could be contained before it reached the Meuse River. As Third Army surged north, the weather worsened. Snow and sleet reduced visibility and slowed movement, yet also grounded German aircraft, temporarily leveling the air superiority that normally favored the Allies. Patton exploited the conditions, pressing forward relentlessly. His orders emphasized aggression, constant contact, and refusal to cede initiative. Delay, he believed, was more dangerous than risk. The relief of Bastogne became the symbolic centerpiece of the campaign, but the broader maneuver mattered just as much. Patton's forces struck the southern shoulder of the German penetration, disrupting supply lines and forcing the enemy to divert armored units away from the main thrust. Every mile gained reduced the momentum of the offensive and increased German fuel consumption at a rate the Reich could not sustain. This was not improvisation born of instinct alone. It was the execution of a concept shaped by months of study, planning, and anticipation. Patton's reputation for impulsiveness masked a methodical understanding of operational art. He did not merely react faster than his peers. He had already accepted the possibility they dismissed and prepared accordingly. As the battle unfolded, the contrast between expectation and reality defined every decision. German commanders pressed forward knowing their margins were shrinking. Allied leaders raced to stabilize a front they believed no longer vulnerable. Patton's maneuver demonstrated that foresight under uncertainty could offset even the most dangerous surprises. The Ardennes would become a test not only of endurance, but of whose understanding of war proved closest to reality when assumptions collapsed and consequences arrived without warning. As Third Army's leading elements closed on the southern approaches to Bastogne, the battlefield revealed the true cost of the German gamble. Roads were choked with abandoned vehicles, dead horses, and shattered equipment, evidence of an offensive already straining against its own limits. German units that had advanced rapidly during the first days now struggled to maintain cohesion, their timetables disrupted by unexpected resistance, and the sheer difficulty of moving heavy armor through forested terrain under winter conditions. Fuel shortages, anticipated by Allied planners but underestimated in urgency by German command, began to dictate operational choices more than strategic intent. Patton understood that time was the decisive factor. Every hour the German spearheads remained intact increased the danger to the Allied front, but every hour they were forced to fight defensively drained resources they could not replace. Orders from Third Army headquarters emphasized continuous pressure rather than decisive engagement alone. Units were instructed to fix the enemy, disrupt movement, and deny rest. The objective was not merely to reach Bastogne, but to unravel the offensive's internal logic by forcing German commanders to react rather than advance. Inside Bastogne itself, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Encircled American units endured constant artillery fire, dwindling supplies, and freezing temperatures. German demands for surrender were rejected, but the garrison's ability to hold depended entirely on relief arriving before exhaustion or starvation took hold. Patton's timetable was unforgiving. Delays caused by weather, terrain, or enemy resistance could mean the difference between stabilization and catastrophe. The pressure on subordinate commanders was immense, yet Patton allowed little room for hesitation. Communication between corps and divisions operated under severe strain. Radio interference, damaged lines, and the fluid nature of the front complicated coordination. Patton's headquarters compensated through redundancy. Dispatching liaison officers forward to ensure intent was understood even when formal orders lagged behind events. This reliance on clearly communicated objectives rather than rigid instructions reflected Patton's belief that disciplined initiative was essential under conditions of uncertainty. Meanwhile, German command faced its own crisis of control. Hitler's insistence on holding ground and pressing forward collided with reports of stalled advances and mounting losses. Field commanders requested permission to adjust objectives or consolidate gains, only to receive orders that ignored battlefield realities. This disconnect between political will and operational feasibility accelerated the erosion of German effectiveness. Units that might have disengaged and regrouped instead fought on under increasingly unfavorable conditions. The weather, initially an ally of the German offensive, shifted decisively. Clearing skis restored Allied air power, exposing German columns to relentless attack. Fighter bombers targeted supply routes, fuel trucks, and troop concentrations, compounding shortages already reaching critical levels. Patton's ground forces coordinated closely with air units, exploiting windows of opportunity whenever weather allowed. The integration of arms further tilted the balance against an enemy already operating at the edge of endurance. When Third Army finally broke through to Bastogne, the achievement carried significance beyond the immediate tactical success. The penetration fractured the southern shoulder of the German Bulge, forcing a redistribution of forces that blunted the main thrust toward the Meuse. German units now faced the prospect of encirclement themselves, their offensive transformed into a fight for survival. The initiative had shifted decisively. Yet Patton did not treat the relief as an endpoint. He pressed the attack relentlessly, expanding the corridor and driving deeper into German-held territory. His orders reflected an understanding that partial success invited renewed danger. Only by collapsing the entire offensive could the Allies restore strategic stability. This required sustained effort under conditions that continued to test endurance, logistics, and morale. The broader Allied response also gained coherence as the initial shock wore off. Reinforcements from the north and south converged, tightening the noose around the Bulge. Eisenhower's decision to prioritize containment over immediate counteroffensive reflected lessons learned under pressure. Stabilization first, exploitation later. Patton's actions had bought the time necessary for this coordinated response to take shape. For German forces, the consequences of the failed offensive became unavoidable. Fuel reserves dwindled to nothing. Replacement units failed to arrive. Commanders faced impossible choices between holding exposed positions and attempting withdrawals without authorization. The Ardennes, once chosen for concealment and surprise, became a trap that magnified every logistical weakness. What began as a bid for strategic reversal devolved into a costly drain on Germany's remaining strength. Patton's maneuver through the Ardennes illustrated how preparation under uncertainty could transform chaos into opportunity. His ability to anticipate danger, impose order on movement, and maintain momentum under extreme conditions challenged prevailing assumptions about what modern armies could achieve. The pivot north was not simply a feat of speed, but of mental discipline applied at every level of command. As January wore on and the Bulge slowly flattened, the strategic implications became clear. Germany had expended its last operational reserves in the west for no lasting gain. Allied losses were heavy but replaceable. The road to the Rhine reopened, now guarded by hard-earned experience rather than complacent confidence. The war would not end by Christmas, but its final outcome was no longer in doubt. The Ardennes campaign exposed the fragile line between expectation and reality in World War II. Assumptions collapsed under pressure, and decisions made in hours reshaped months of fighting. Patton's response stood as a case study in how foresight, preparation, and decisive action could alter the course of events even when surprise favored the enemy. The fog lifted, the forest fell silent, and the consequences of December 1944 continued to shape the final chapters of the war in Europe. As the German offensive collapsed inward on itself, the operational tempo did not slow. Allied commanders understood that the retreating enemy, though weakened, remained dangerous. Units withdrawing under pressure were prone to desperate stands, rearguard actions, and localized counterattacks designed to buy time or protect escape routes. Patton ordered Third Army to maintain contact at all costs, believing that disengagement would only allow German formations to regroup and prolong the fighting. Momentum, once gained, had to be preserved through constant pressure. The terrain of the Ardennes amplified every challenge. Narrow roads funneled movement into predictable corridors, making traffic control a battle in itself. Engineers worked continuously to repair bridges, clear wreckage, and lay corduroy roads across frozen ground. Supply officers recalculated fuel and ammunition requirements daily, often hourly, as shifting front lines altered priorities. Patton's insistence on aggressive movement strained these systems to their limits, yet the very strain forced efficiencies that peacetime planning rarely achieved. German commanders, facing the unraveling of their offensive, attempted to extract what remained of their armored strength. Orders shifted from advance to withdrawal, but coordination proved elusive. Communications were unreliable, fuel non-existent, and Allied air power increasingly dominant. Units retreated unevenly, leaving gaps that exposed neighboring formations. Patton exploited these fractures, directing thrusts not toward symbolic objectives, but toward seams where resistance was weakest and collapse most likely. The human dimension of the fighting grew more pronounced as January deepened. Soldiers on both sides endured extreme cold, exhaustion, and psychological strain. Frostbite rivaled combat wounds as a cause of casualties. Patton recognized the toll but refused to relax operational pressure. Rest, he believed, would come after victory, not before. His orders balanced urgency with pragmatism, rotating units when possible while ensuring fresh forces replaced those pulled back. Within Allied high command, the lessons of the Ardennes reshaped strategic thinking. The assumption that Germany was incapable of large-scale counteroffensives had been decisively disproven. Intelligence procedures were reevaluated, and greater weight was given to dissenting assessments that challenged prevailing optimism. Patton's earlier warnings gained retrospective credibility, reinforcing the value of commanders willing to question consensus under conditions of uncertainty. As Third Army advanced eastward, the landscape bore the scars of both German ambition and Allied response. Destroyed villages, burned-out armor, and abandoned equipment marked the routes of retreat. These physical remnants told a story of an offensive that had overreached and an enemy response that had adapted under fire. Patton viewed the aftermath not as a victory parade, but as confirmation of the costs imposed by miscalculation. The coordination between Allied armies tightened as the front stabilized. British and American units synchronized advances, closing gaps and eliminating salients. The experience of December and January fostered a more cautious optimism, grounded in respect for the enemy's remaining capabilities. Patton's role within this framework remained aggressive but increasingly integrated, his actions aligned with a broader operational design shaped by shared experience. German losses in the Ardennes were not merely numerical. The offensive consumed irreplaceable veteran formations and shattered the myth that boldness alone could compensate for material inferiority. For Patton, this outcome reinforced a core belief: audacity must be paired with preparation, and surprise is most effective when anticipated rather than assumed impossible. His success lay not in reckless advance, but in disciplined readiness. As winter began to loosen its grip, the implications of the Battle of the Bulge extended beyond immediate tactical results. The failure of Germany's last major offensive in the West cleared the way for Allied crossings of the Rhine and accelerated the endgame of the war. Patton's pivot north became a reference point in military studies, illustrating how adaptability under pressure could redefine what was considered feasible. The Ardennes campaign left no clear dividing line between crisis and resolution. Instead, it flowed into the final offensives of early 1945, carrying forward lessons learned in fog, snow, and uncertainty. Patton emerged not only as a symbol of relentless attack, but as a commander whose understanding of consequence shaped decisions long before the first shots were fired. The forest that had hidden 3 German armies now stood as silent testimony to the limits of surprise and the enduring impact of preparation when war refuses to follow expectations. With the Ardennes crisis receding, the operational focus shifted steadily eastward, but the psychological imprint of the battle remained fresh within Allied ranks. Commanders who had once spoken confidently of an imminent end to the war now approached planning with sharper caution. Patton, though never abandoning his aggressive instincts, absorbed these lessons into his conduct. He pushed Third Army forward with urgency, yet demanded tighter reconnaissance, clearer intelligence reporting, and more rigorous contingency planning than before December. The experience had validated his distrust of optimistic assumptions. The advance toward the German frontier unfolded through terrain still scarred by winter fighting. Roads were cratered, bridges destroyed, and civilian populations displaced or traumatized by months of movement and counter-movement. Patton's units encountered a mixture of organized resistance and sudden collapse, often within the same day. German formations were uneven in quality, some reduced to ad hoc battle groups, others still capable of stiff defense. The uncertainty required constant recalibration of plans, reinforcing the importance of decentralized execution guided by clear intent. Logistics remained the quiet determinant of success. Fuel shortages, though eased since the height of the Ardennes fighting, continued to constrain tempo. Supply lines stretched ever longer as Third Army advanced, demanding careful prioritization. Patton's staff worked to balance speed with sustainability, understanding that an overextended force invited the kind of vulnerability the Allies themselves had faced in December. The lesson was clear. Momentum was valuable, but only if supported. German command, meanwhile, struggled to reassert coherence. The failure of the Ardennes offensive had deepened fractures between political leadership and military reality. Orders from Berlin often demanded impossible feats, ignoring the degraded state of units and infrastructure. Field commanders adapted as best they could, sometimes bending or quietly ignoring directives to preserve what remained of their forces. This erosion of centralized control contrasted sharply with the Allied emphasis on disciplined flexibility. As Third Army pressed on, encounters with evidence of Nazi crimes became more frequent. Liberated camps and devastated communities confronted soldiers with the moral dimensions of the war in stark terms. These discoveries intensified emotions already strained by months of combat, testing discipline once again. Patton responded with firm directives, insisting that outrage, however justified, must not compromise order or mission focus. His stance reflected a belief that justice required structure, not impulse. Coordination with Allied air forces grew increasingly decisive. With the weather improving, air superiority allowed systematic destruction of German transport and communication networks. Patton integrated air-ground operations into his planning, using air power to isolate battlefields and prevent German units from regrouping. The synergy between arms underscored how the lessons of the Ardennes had accelerated learning across the Allied command. By late winter, The cumulative effect of these pressures was unmistakable. German resistance thinned, not solely from defeat in battle, but from exhaustion of options. Patton's relentless approach exploited this erosion, driving advances that forced the enemy to choose between withdrawal and annihilation. Each decision point narrowed the path forward for Germany, compressing the war toward its conclusion. Yet Patton remained acutely aware that desperation could still produce danger. The memory of December 1944 served as a constant reminder that an enemy pushed to the brink might attempt one final disruption. Orders emphasized vigilance even in apparent success, maintaining readiness against the unexpected. The balance between confidence and caution defined this phase of operations. As Allied forces approached the Rhine, the strategic horizon expanded beyond immediate combat. Planning increasingly accounted for occupation, security, and the management of surrendering forces. Patton's experiences in the Ardennes informed his views on this transition. He recognized that the collapse of organized resistance would create new challenges as complex as those faced in battle, requiring discipline and foresight under different forms of pressure. The path from the fog-filled forests of Belgium to the heart of Germany traced a continuum of decision-making shaped by uncertainty and consequence. Patton's role in that journey illustrated how preparation, adaptability, and relentless focus could turn crisis into momentum. The Battle of the Bulge did not stand apart as an isolated episode. It became an integral chapter in the unfolding logic of the war, influencing every step that followed as the Allies closed in on the final defeat of Nazi Germany.